The path to mastery leads through the heart of adversity. Challenge is the raw material from which courage and strength are forged. Warriors are not defined by events. Warriors define them. Warriors conquer themselves before all else. Warriors are relentless in their service to others. Join us as we open our hearts and hone our minds to a razor's edge. It doesn't matter how slow you go, only that you do not stop. Your time is now. And now your host, Jason McKenzie.
Hey everybody, how's it going? Welcome to another episode of the Mental Health Warriors podcast. So first of all, I want to tell you about the Dad Edge Alliance. So my God, this is such an incredible community of men. So I'm good buddies with the founder of the Good Dad Project and the Dad Edge podcast, which is an incredibly popular podcast, my buddy Larry Hagner. And he runs a membership community called the Dad Edge Alliance, and it is absolutely crazy what is happening in there. So for guys out there who are looking for, a tribe or feeling like they are missing something, I can't not stress enough how game changing this community is. There's probably about 250 guys in there right now, and they're the kindest, most compassionate, and just amazing men working to make themselves better, supporting each other. And if you want that type of people around you, and trust me, you want that type of people around you, think about joining the Dad Edge. It's like literally $67 a month. It's barely more than your gym membership. And it's just unbelievable how many men in there are working hard and changing their lives. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing. So if you want to find out more about the Dad Edge Alliance, go to gooddadproject.com/alliance and you'll see what it's all about. There's community calls in there. There's team calls. There's just tons of free resources, books and content, and, tons of videos. And we're going to be doing courses in there soon. It is unbelievable. So check it out. It could be an absolute game changer for you. And at the very least, it'll open your eyes to see that there's a different kind of person out there than you're used to hanging around with. And what happens when you get around that type of person? Because if I've learned anything over the years, it's that man, oh man, the type of person we hang around influences the quality of our lives in a way that is hard to describe. So check it out. gooddadproject.com/alliance, and I'll include that in the show notes page. Now, on to the show. This is a conversation I had with Dan Griffn, who is the founder of Man Rules. And we talk a lot about how traditional notions of masculinity are influencing men, how, it's influencing our sense of self and our relationships. And we talk a lot about finding a different way, right? Because we're all kind of told that, what a man is supposed to be, like what a real man is supposed to be. And I don't know, for myself, I don't remember specifically anyone ever telling me this is how I was supposed to be, which is an interesting thing to think about because, my dad certainly didn't do it. I mean, he modeled behavior, but he was always a good guy. And maybe he didn't have the emotional tools that, say, for example, I have, but he certainly gave me the platform and the space to start becoming the person who would develop these tools. But, he wasn't around grabbing me by the lapels and you gotta, be a man or anything like that. So where'd I get it from? It's a really interesting thing to think about, right? Obviously it must have been the images I got on TV and all that kind of stuff. But regardless, I grew up with a pretty solid idea of what it meant to be a dude, which I've talked about a million times, obviously held me back in an incredibly profound way for a long time. So Dan Griffn is doing something about it, which is absolutely awesome, right? So he's an internationally recognized author, thought leader, and expert on men's relationships and masculinity. And he's dedicated his work and life into exploring and redefining what it means to be a man in the 21st century. He's dedicated to helping men be better men by understanding the impact of the man rules on their lives and finding successes in their personal lives they're striving for. And finding the success in their personal lives they're striving for in their professional lives. His book, A Man's Way Through Relationships, is the first book written specifically to help men create healthy relationships while navigating the challenges of the man rules. Those ideas meant, which are, when he talks about the man rules, he's talking about those ideas that men internalize at a very young age about how to be real boys and men. In 2015, Dan was honored to be named a senior fellow at the world-renowned leader for treating addiction and trauma, the Meadows. So yeah, he's a really cool dude. He dealt with some addiction issues like in his younger life and overcame them. And it's really, I like talking to people like Dan because, I mean, not only is he highly educated and he is a thought leader, but it's just cool to have conversations about this stuff because sometimes I feel like, you know, if a byproduct of the work that I'm doing is helping helping men be different fathers to their children, then, you know, that's a pretty powerful thing. And so I feel like, you know, I've often wondered if I should be working with kids to help them like understand some of the stuff, but I feel right now like my calling is to work with men to help them be the kind of fathers that will raise the kind of kids that will maybe not have to subscribe to or be imprisoned by the man rules. So, Dan, thank you, brother, for this conversation. Thank you for the work that you are doing to redefine masculinity. And to my wonderful, amazing audience, I hope you enjoy this podcast, and we will see you on the other side, just like we always do. Dan, welcome to the Mental Health Warriors podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me, Jason. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I enjoyed our conversation on your podcast so much. It's nice to have the tables turned, and we can either continue where we left off or start anew.
Yeah, that's right. Be gentle.
I will. I'll do my best. So why don't you tell the audience what you're working on right now and why it's important to you?
Sure. So, you know, my name is Dan Griffn. I've been working in the mental health and addictions field for over 20 years, and I did my master's research looking at the social construction of masculinity in the culture of Alcoholics Anonymous. And it was the first qualitative research of its kind. And I just interviewed men in recovery, and it was just so fascinating for me to hear what men were talking about when they felt less inhibited or less restricted about how, quote unquote, real men are supposed to talk. And in the 12-step culture, it really is such a different culture for men to begin. And so basically, in the last 8 years, I've built a whole consulting business around helping programs and individuals better understand the kind of contradictions and the tension between what it means to live a more conscious life as a man versus the way we're raised, which is what I refer to as the man rules. Other people talk about the man box and that sort of thing. But I talk about the man rules, and I've unpacked it very, very comprehensively in some of my writing and in a lot of my presentations and work that I do. And so I've got the Man Rules podcast. And so it's just been great. It's just been a lot of fun being one of the voices out there that's really saying, you know, what does it mean to be a man in the 21st century? And how do we support other men and their loved ones and family members in being able to not only support them, but better understand their lives and their relationships.
Yeah, that's really resonates with me. So do you see a difference? You alluded to AA. Do you see a difference in the culture within AA as it relates to men and women?
Well, so there's a couple ways to answer that. So in the 12-step culture, that's not just AA, but all the different quote-unquote anonymous programs, there's a really strong and common thread of the 12-step principles and the 12 traditions, and it really is a very distinct culture. So men and women in that culture have more in common within that culture than they do with maybe people outside of that culture from the perspective of recovery and personal growth. For men and women in the 12-step culture, there's definitely a difference. And one of the things is that all the differences and all the challenges, social challenges and political challenges that affect men and women's relationships outside of the 12-step culture, they filter into the 12-step culture as well. And but there's a greater awareness, I find, and a willingness to talk differently about that. So men are more likely to probably notice some of their sexist attitudes, some of their homophobic attitudes, and so that helps with women. But one of the ways I would actually summarize it, and this came from a friend of mine, but I think it's really powerful. When men get into recovery, by virtue of what it means to be in recovery, as far as being vulnerable, sharing feelings, asking for help, being more relational, what you're really doing for those men, for the most part, is taking something away from them. But for women who you're validating how they've been raised in many ways, you're giving them something. You're giving them this sense of honor and validation and even wisdom, because they're showing up in the culture in a way that they've already have been raised but has been devalued in the larger culture.
God, that's really interesting.
Yeah, that's what happens when you're a sociologist. You sit around and think about that kind of shit, and it's like, Jesus, can I turn it off, man? Can't I just watch a Disney movie without deconstructing all the gender freaking undertones and overtones of every movie?
Oh, yeah, no doubt. Do men, I don't know if you know the answer to this question. I was just thinking about what you were saying, though. Do men often take longer to seek treatment? Is that a part of the way of the man rules, for example? Are women more willing to seek out treatment in a more timely manner or admit they have a problem?
Well, I think there's an element of that, right? I mean, I think in the work that you do also must encounter that. But yeah, I mean, the man rules, a deep part of the man rules is don't ask for help and don't look weak. And quite honestly, don't be a girl. I mean, that's a huge one. Don't be a girl. Don't really do girl, quote unquote, girly things. And therapy, for the most part, tends to be seen as feminine and female. And I think the way that some men, you may be one of them actually, but I mean, some men out there, the way that they're helping men get over that hurdle is, even though they're doing a lot of therapeutic interventions, they're calling it coaching. And then you call it coaching, and more men are more likely to engage. When you're in the treatment and mental health field, you may or may not call it coaching. From a licensing standpoint, you really can't. And so there could be a semantics piece, but I think men are definitely more challenged to do that. I mean, to admit, like in addiction, you're admitting that you are unable to stop using of your own volition and your own quote unquote willpower. That's a huge thing for men. And then they have to navigate the whole concern about looking weak.
Yeah, I certainly, from personal experiences, that's exactly what I dealt with, was just not, there's a whole web of facets to it, I guess. But a big part of it was definitely not being willing to admit I'd done my shit together. So,
yeah, and that was not only part of it for me. I've been in recovery now for a long time. 23 years. So I was very young when I got into the program and into my own kind of process of recovery. And, what that means for me is I haven't found it necessary to take to drink or use any other illicit substance, since May of 1994. And so that's a big deal for me. However, age 45, I still struggle with asking for help, not wanting to look weak. What I talk about all the time is men might get over that first hurdle of getting some help and getting involved, but I think because those man rules are so strong and it's so embedded in us to not necessarily seek that kind of help, I find that it's a daily practice of discipline and awareness to be able to be like, okay, I'm going to ask for help again and again and again and again and again and again and again, and I'm going to be vulnerable again and again and again and again and again. You know, I mean, you basically can go through some of the most dominant man rules, and when men are engaged in any kind of personal growth, coaching, therapy, recovery, it's not a one and done. It's a regular practice of coming up against those man rules and then having the humility and the vulnerability and the risk to go through it again.
Oh, definitely. I always tell guys when I'm describing this to them, it's like I frame it in the context of being skillful, because that's something that guys can resonate with. But I mean, vulnerability and confidence, like they might be feelings or emotions or whatever, but they're also skills that people need to develop. And you develop them by just, as you're saying, doing them over and over and over again, even in the face of not wanting to do them, and then learning from the experience, applying them again, and just keep plugging away at it. And eventually it becomes something that's ingrained enough that the fear, maybe the fear doesn't always go away, but it's you use it as a, maybe, you know, an instructive little voice in the back of your head rather than something that paralyzes you from moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question using different language makes a total difference. You can have guys stepping into everything that basically has a quasi-therapeutic approach to it, but the language you're using, you know, makes a difference. I talk about building your muscle. You're building emotional muscle. You're building relational muscle. You know, you talk about skill building. You talk about coaching. All of that, I think, helps to mitigate the shame that some men feel around moving into a more quote unquote therapeutic process, you know. So it's really, I think it's really important, and what you're doing, what other guys out there are doing and attempting to normalize all of this is critical.
So let's talk about a little bit more about your story. So you mentioned that you entered this 12-step program at a very early age. Can you tell us about sort of what led up to that point, and maybe talking through that, how understanding or deconstructing these man rules became important to you?
Yeah, sure. So, my story is very interesting. I mean, looking at the man rules was going on with me before I was in recovery. I had a powerful experience growing up, where growing up in an alcoholic home, which that's not unique by any means, but growing up in an alcoholic home, and my dad just really, really struggled, not only with his alcoholism, but with his temper. And it was tough. It was really tough living in such a volatile and unhealthy home, and unsafe home. But I also wasn't growing physically. And so I ended up being treated with growth hormone. And I was probably one of the first generations of really kind of starting to get the growth hormone to grow. And so I got shots of testosterone when I was like late 15, 16. And up until that point, you know, when you have the physical, not only like the psychological evidence, but the physical evidence that you're quote unquote not a man, while all of your peers and even younger are becoming men. I mean, you have different choices, and the choice I made was to deconstruct the man rules, was to deconstruct masculinity. So it was very shame-based. There wasn't any sense of real validation, but I stood outside of so much of dominant, you know, masculinity. So when I got into recovery, and for me, the decision to get into recovery, watching my father drink himself to death, and he ultimately did 2 years after I got sober, it was just so painful. And watching myself go down that road and having enough people come into my life saying, like, you've got a problem. Like, my behavior was very, very not only out of control, but I was just very, very mercurial, right? I mean, it was very much a Jekyll and Hyde at any given moment. And, you know, there are a lot of my peers and friends in college who drank the way I did and used other drugs the way I did. And I don't know if they were alcoholic. I don't know if they had an addictive disorder. But what I know is that different pieces of awareness came together enough for me that I was able to say, I'm done. I'm done. There's nothing positive coming out of this, and the negatives are already so significant that I have every reason to believe that if I continue on this path, what I'm watching happen to my father is, what I have to look forward to and what will happen. And so the way I talk about it is, my decision to get sober at 21, I had lots and lots of evidence to support it. But at the end of the day, getting older, maturing, and some people just mature out of what looks like an apparent addiction, or there's lots of different ways. But I just say, look, if at this point there's nothing in my life that seems to be lacking anything because I don't use alcohol or other drugs. And I've been around long enough that I've watched the guys who thought that it was a phase, thought that they'd go back. They got clean and sober when they were 19, 21, 23, 29. And I've watched their lives get good, and then I've watched them use again, and I've watched their lives get really bad. And that would probably happen to me. I don't know. I can't predict, but what I can say is that for me, it's kind of like playing Russian roulette when you got 5 bullets in the chamber. And I'm not interested in doing that. So for me, the story has been one of first getting into recovery and being like, okay, I'm really young. Does this fit for me? And what it's been now for me is it's been like, okay, what does like true emotional sobriety look like? Like, what does it mean not to just not use, but to deal with the underlying trauma that has affected my most intimate relationships, to be able to make sure that I'm taking care of myself emotionally as my life gets better and better and better, which sometimes can be just as scary for somebody or even more scary for somebody than when their life's not going very well. All of that has been a part of it, but the one piece that was most significant for me, because I talk about this concept of the water, and it's really one of the guiding components of the work I do, and it just simply, it goes to this little story of these 2 fish are at the bottom of the ocean. Another fish swims up and says, hey guys, how's the water? Swims off, and the 2 fish look at each other and they say, well, what the hell is water? And like, that's the reality, right? That's our consciousness or lack of consciousness in our lives. And I was already in sociology. I was already looking at gender. I was looking at masculinity when I walked into my first meeting and a man tried to hug me. And when I heard men talking about fear and being vulnerable and showing weakness. And so in many ways, I walked into my first recovery meeting and I saw the water. And I spent a lot of time wondering if other men were seeing the water too. Were they listening to themselves and how they talked about being men and how they talked about their lives? And for the most part, they didn't. And so it just began this process of me talking to other men, me noticing what was happening in my life. And for the last 8 years now, I've dedicated my life to saying, it's not whether men can get clean. It's not whether men can find recovery. It's what happens at 5 or 10 or 15 years into the process that tends to kick so many men's ass, and what can we do to prepare them now for that? So it's been very deeply, deeply intertwined with my own story, my own narrative of, how do men are very good at looking good on the outside. Men are very good at finding success in our careers. But what about our marriages? What about as parents? It's a totally different skill set in some ways that can get that, or at least the pressure to succeed and the pressure to be somebody, quote unquote, professionally, can be very, very strong. And challenges of being a father and being a spouse and just being an upstanding human being can sometimes easily get lost in the more dominant pressures. And so that's a big part of the work I do, is helping men and women see the water, make more conscious decisions, and really say, like, who do I really want to be, not who am I being driven to be by these supposed rules.
Oh man, there's so much to unpack there. That was great. It's funny when you talk about that, because I think that's one of the things that really struck me with what you were saying was sort of the emotional journey post, stopping drinking or while you're in recovery. Because I think for me, what's been such a unexpected realization or part of the journey is that once I got sober, I realized that at 41 years old, that I didn't really know myself very well at all. I mean, I had been so busy conforming to the man rules that, I don't know, it was almost like a caricature of myself. And as I've gone through, you realize that I've realized that just so many of the things that I was saying that I thought were true were not. Like, so for example, I thought I was a wonderful, caring husband. And in many ways I was, but because I didn't truly know myself, there's no way that my wife could truly know me either. And as we go through this process, I mean, this still happens to this day. It's like the onion still gets peeled back, and I'm like, wow. And it's not that I'm trying to hide things from my wife. It's that it just takes time and practice and intention to continue to learn the things about yourself that will allow you to be more open with your wife and let her see more of you, but that's just a part of the journey. I never even really considered.
Yeah, it's so true. God, it's so true. I mean, and, something I say all the time is it's not about doing it perfectly. It's about doing it consciously. And, because you will never do it perfectly. And here I am, does it matter that I've got 23 years of sobriety? Yes, at some level it does. But at the end of the day, I'm a human being on a human journey, and I'm just trying to figure all this stuff out as best I can. And, I don't know what it's like to be a father sober. So that's a whole new journey. I don't know what it's like to be a husband sober. So that's a whole new journey. I don't know what it's like to be successful and have a career and actually show up in life more authentically. So you're absolutely right. I mean, it's layer after layer after layer. And this past year, I've been looking at some stuff that, Jesus, I mean, it's like, where the hell did that come from? I mean, like, where did that come from? And here's what I found, Jason, and I don't know if you're finding this or not. It is those of us who put ourselves out there and use our story as part of the not fodder, but really part of the material, but also the inspiration for how we connect with other people and the kind of charismatic component. We have to be like even more on guard. I certainly do, because I've tried to be very, very aware of how much I pay attention to my own self-care, my own growth and development. But all I know is it can get tricky. And all I know is that it's really easy, and this might be particularly for men, it's really easy to have the answers. And that caricature that you talked about, it just becomes another character. It just becomes another caricature, and now you're now the character that I became in some ways was the vulnerable guy who was walking a more conscious path. Like, that became part of the caricature, and then that's when it's a real mind fuck.
Oh, no shit. Oh, that's funny. And
Can I say that on your podcast?
Oh, fuck, yeah, it's a free for all.
Yeah.
You're right, though.
For the most part, I don't use that language, but it really fits there because it's like, it's powerful. And whether you're out there doing like what we're doing, or if you're just a guy, you're just a guy who's walking a more conscious path, it can become its own barrier to that next level of consciousness and authenticity.
Yeah, man, that really speaks to me. And I think it's something else that's interesting, and it's that I've experienced. I don't know if you have, but is that, and this is kind of a blessing and a curse in a way, but I've realized that the motivations and language you use to share the stories of your past change the way you view it. So what I've realized is that as I've, for example, being the vulnerable guy as well, I've been really open about a lot of the mistakes that I've made. And that really seems to connect with people. And then I've just realized recently, like this year, as I tell these stories about my past, and I focus a lot of times on the mistakes I've made, that over time in my mind, they were gaining like unwarranted prominence in my view of my past. So I was starting to think, like, when my wife was sick and all that stuff, I was starting to actually think, God, I was a fucking dick during that time, And then I went back and I read all kinds of journaling that I had taken from way back when during that time. And I realized, oh my God, like that was a hellish period of my life. And there's so many things I did right. That, the idea of that I'm labeling myself like I was an asshole during that time. Yeah, I made some mistakes, but on balance, I did a lot of things that were absolutely to the best of my ability. And it's interesting how subjective reality is, So like learning that lesson made me realize that, wow, not only can I change, like, am I changing my perspective on the past, but it just drove home the point that the language I use to describe myself now and to describe the future, that is unbelievably powerful.
There's no question about it. I mean, there's a classic story in Native American or more indigenous circles, but I mean, that's how I've encountered it, where the little boy is sitting with his grandfather. Have you heard that one? He's sitting with his grandfather. His grandfather's talking about the two sides of the earth, of the world, and there is the good side, and the side that wants us to love and to grow and connect, and then there's the other side that wants us to isolate and be alone and to hurt others, and he describes them as wolves. Each one is a different wolf, and the little boy asks his grandfather, well, then, how do I know? How do I know which wolf is going to win? And the grandfather says, whichever one you feed is the one that grows. And, to me, that's exactly what you're saying. I mean, my father has changed dramatically the more I do this work. My childhood has changed dramatically the more I do this work. The challenge is that it can change intellectually, but that doesn't mean that I have effectively grieved the pain of that. That doesn't mean that I've allowed that part of me that had the shit beat out of him and that was constantly being shamed and criticized and made fun of and isolated. That doesn't mean that part of me has healed or has been given a voice or given a space to truly be heard. And that's so antithetical to the man rules. I mean, I've watched a lot of men over the years get into this work and this personal work, and they do a wonderful job. I mean, this is not to disparage anybody, but it's those layers of the onion. And at some point, the more we walk this path, I think, the more we come to a place where if we're not grieving, well, let me say it for me. What I found recently in the last couple of years is I've had some incredible insight, but I was not truly grieving or giving voice to that little boy who was so deeply hurt and that adolescent who was so deeply disconnected, that they were having a much greater influence on my personal relationships, especially with my daughter and my wife, than I ever realized. And as my daughter gets older and gets more independent and has more of her own personality, she's also getting to the age where I was, where the abuse intensified and my dad's kind of interactions with me grew worse and worse. And if I'm not really careful, that stuff comes up and I don't see it. And so it's about reframing the narrative, but it can't, at least for me, right? It just has, there's no way it could be an intellectual journey, and even just an emotional journey in the present moment, that there's a real power I've found to honoring my pain from the past, allowing myself to grieve it, and then it takes the power away. More men are being driven by the pain of their past than they could ever realize, because the man rules tell us not to honor that pain and not to honor that little boy or to honor that adolescent because that's weak, or because, you know, that was so long ago and I'm now a 40-year-old man, that doesn't matter, or it was for my own good. You know, there's all of that language and messaging that we put on ourselves internally, but it has a massive impact, I've found, on our relationships in our present day lives.
I think that's a very important, something very important that you just brought up, because what I see quite frequently, I'm sure you see this all the time, is that what guys tend to do, and this is totally man rule driven, but they, I think to guys, dealing with the trauma of the past often means like stuffing it down and ignoring it, or attempting to ignore it, is a valid way of dealing with it. And so
Absolutely.
what happens with guys is they'll be in like their 30s or their 40s and they're in tremendous pain. You know, they're suffering anxiety or depression or feeling like a failure. They're not measuring up. They feel like terrible husbands and wives, and they're not, I think in some cases they're unaware of how the trauma they've experienced in the past is contributing to how they're feeling right now. And I think sometimes maybe they have some level of awareness, but they're just too fucking afraid to go back and confront it.
And they don't know they're afraid, and nobody is shining a light for them to be able to do that. They might not even have the support that they need in their lives to be able to do that, because women have internalized the man rules and women have the woman rules, and it gets all kinds of messed up in those interactions. And so, you know, what I say all the time is another word for a man with trauma is asshole.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, you're right.
And so who has compassion for the asshole, and who wants to help the asshole, and who wants to say, oh, well, gosh, I'm sorry, you know, you had a rough childhood. And then there are those who are like, you know, the partners of the assholes are sometimes the ones who, with the best of intention, don't realize how much they're hurting their relationship, because they're like, oh, he had such a tough upbringing. His father was so horrible to him. Oh, it's okay. Yeah, he yells at me sometimes, but actually I shouldn't say it like that, because I'm almost mocking that, you know, the partner, but it's very complicated, you know, but partners can really, like, unintentionally really feed that, because they're not actually having compassion for the man. Because true compassion would say, oh my God, I'm so sorry you went through that, and your behavior now is not okay, because I know it's not reflective of the man you want to be. But there's that element that says, oh, he yells at me, he yells at the kids, he does this, he does that, but man, he's been through so much, and so there becomes this enabling or this conspiring in not just that asshole behavior, but the continued re-traumatization of that man.
I was just thinking what you said connected with me there, because when I was sort of near the end of my drinking career, what started to make sense to me, or I started to believe in some way, I think, was the way my wife talked to me about drinking. And she didn't come at it from the point of view of being angry. I mean, there was times she got pissed at me, obviously, but for the most part, she didn't come at it from the point of view about being angry. I think she tolerated it for as long as she did, because she acknowledged that I had been through the trauma I had been through. But then what she started to say to me was, you're capable of more than this. You know, I want you to be, it's really important to me that you become the man that I know you can be. And when she was speaking to me like that, it really, that's That's kind of a hard thing it was a hard thing for me to try to rationalize away. I mean, like she was coming at it from a place of love. She obviously wanted what was best for me. She obviously wanted what was best for us. And she believed in me. Like, that's a hard thing to get angry at.
Yeah, that is, I mean, and that's the other thing, right? For your listeners is to know, like, it's complicated. It's really complicated. I mean, you're watching somebody you love destroy themselves, and sometimes they might even be, destroying you in certain ways, verbally, emotionally, just from a place of disconnection. And, it's tough. There's no manuals out there, and people just don't necessarily know how to do it. And, what we talk about so I spend a lot of time in this space of men's trauma and trauma in general, and what we tend to do is that people's trauma runs into each other. And people get married and they get into relationships and they get into these connections, and their trauma's running into each other, and their trauma tends to operate at the same level. And so my trauma, for me, the way trauma has impacted me has been through rage and a deep, deep amount of shame and a lot of unprocessed grief. And then the way I think some of my partner's trauma has been through, one, being a woman in our society, period. Two, having to not having grown up in a space where there was any healthy emotional expression, or as a woman not having any place for anger, and having those woman rules that say you got to take care of people, you got to be there for everybody other than yourself. I mean, it can get really toxic really quick, and then they just feed off of each other, and then the other person's the source. And but people can live in that space for a really long time, and they're just massively disconnected under the illusion of kind of just living together and getting along.
So one of the things you touched on earlier was the importance that you've realized the importance of taking care of yourself emotionally. And I know, especially for a lot of guys, that's a concept that doesn't really, probably not a concept that they have considered. Taking care of themselves emotionally probably often means going and getting shit-faced with their buddies. But what does that look like, I guess, for you? And how do you talk to guys about this idea?
Yeah, well, that's great, right? So, I mean, I make no bones about it, and I've suffered from stepping away or moving away from what I know is good, healthy self-care. So I really appreciate the question. So yeah, there's a couple things. I mean, I still engage in recovery meetings, so mutual support groups of some kind, men's groups, whatever it is. I see a therapist. I journal. I read meditation books. I play music. I exercise a lot. I get a good amount of sleep. My partner and I, we have regular check-ins around our marriage, and that's part of how I take care of myself emotionally, so I make sure I'm engaged in that relationship. So there's a whole list of things. The journaling I found to be really, really powerful and important. I have a daily structure at the end of my day. I review my day, and I look at all the positives, and I look at all the negatives, and I look at what I did well and where I could have done things differently, and if there's anything I need to clean up from today about what I might need to do the next day in order to take care of that. And that's a very common 12-step practice. But those are all key pieces. I mean, it's just like if you told somebody they had to take care of themselves physically, you would have some pretty common lists that people do. And so when we talk about taking care of ourselves emotionally, I think there's some fairly common lists that we do. But you're right. Like for men, this isn't in our lexicon. This isn't in our experience. And at some point, we get to normalize it. Changing the language, I think, helps. And instead of journaling, you call it recording your thoughts, or you call it taking some time to just reflect on your day, or some people would even do it more where it's even kind of takes more of a business sort of approach to it, and you say, I want you to look at your day, and I want you to look at what you did well and didn't do well so that you can continually improve. And they take some of the kind of emotional or therapeutic process out of it. But I think what you're doing, what I'm doing, what many others are doing is we're attempting to normalize this conversation for men. So it gets to the point where, like, for me, I have no problem saying I do therapy, I do journaling. The language doesn't matter to me because there's very little baggage for me around that anymore.
Yeah, I feel the same way. And I mean, that, as we were saying earlier, that just takes time and repetition. If you're talking to men about this stuff who might not be about the man rules, who might not be, say, familiar with them, or might be, sort of ensnared in the middle of the man rules, and you talk about taking care of themselves emotionally, how do you talk to them about that in language they can understand? And how do you describe, what embracing that might create in their lives?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one, I mean, I actually do some of the actual initial rapport building I do is I'm like, let's just talk about how things are working in your life and just tell me what's working and what's not working. And even that alone can be really difficult for a guy to do because at a certain level, his definition of what working means is different. And like you said, I mean, there's this level of fear and shame that so many men have that they've just never given themselves permission to touch or to notice or to have language for. So part of it for me is, how do I help them begin to access that in a very safe and a very healthy and sort of gradual way? And so, part of it is talking to them about the man rules. Because what I've found, Jason, is that when I talk to a guy about the man rules and we just begin to quote unquote see the water, when we begin to just kind of name it, even though like guys have some familiarity with it, when I share about how it's impacted my life, it gives them permission to talk about how it's impacting their lives. And then I spend a lot of time listening, just reflecting back, asking some questions, like, how has this one been affecting you? How do you see it like showing up in your life? Because all of a sudden they have like a broad framework, a new lens through which they can view different experiences. And it's not like they were in denial. It's not like they were avoiding things. They just didn't know what they didn't know. And so with this new information, it's kind of like, so let's talk about this man rule of don't ask for help. How do you see that showing up in your life? Or the don't cry or don't be emotional. But I usually have them name the rules themselves. I don't name them for them because there's something very powerful about them being able to name them, even though I know exactly what they're going to say. And then we just open that beginning conversation. And what I found is that when we begin to place things in the context of the man rules, it really helps to mitigate the shame. And it really helps for the men to say, oh, holy shit. Like that voice in me that says I'm a bad man, or I'm not a real man, or there's something wrong with me. It's like now I have a new context, and it's more like, oh, okay, I come by a lot of this behavior and a lot of this pain honestly. And so I think it brings a whole level of shame reduction and compassion and even self-compassion that, 20 minutes ago they just simply could not have imagined because the context just wasn't available.
Yeah, I love that. I love the idea of sort of putting words to the man rules and taking ownership, maybe not taking ownership over them, but just putting words to them and making them real and helping them understand how they came by them. I think that's really important. One thing you were talking about there, and you mentioned the word safety, and I never really thought about it this way until I would listen to you talk. But I guess one of the real ideas or problems with the idea of safety is that men are used to being the ones or believe they're the ones who are supposed to create safety and not need it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So what's brilliant for me and very like makes it a lot easier for me to help engage with men when I talk about the man rules. So like if I have a group of men and we're doing a retreat, or I have a group of men and we're like kind of meeting for the first time, I always talk about the water. I always walk them through the man rules with them naming all of them. And then what I do is I say, well, let's think about this. When you were younger and you were a boy, chances are you were emotional, you were vulnerable, you asked for help, you did all this stuff, and at some point you stopped doing it. Why did you stop doing it? And inevitably, I'll hear, well, because it got me acceptance. Why else did you start doing it? Because that's just what boys did. That's what men did. That's what I was noticing. And I'm like, right, so you got accepted. Underneath that acceptance, what did you get? And they'll say, oh, I don't know. And it might take a little bit of time, but in a couple of minutes, as we layer down, it always comes down to the fact that the man rules are about safety. And they were about our safety, and they are still about our safety. And so when so many men are still kind of stuck or focused on the man rules, it's only because it's what keeps them safe. And so what I try to do in that part of the conversation is I normalize it. I'm like, yeah, like I get it not crying. I get it not asking for help. And so I change, but by virtue of that, I give a whole new appreciation for what safety means. And the men seem to really, really appreciate that because it also really, really validates the man rules. And they get to be like, oh, so I'm not an asshole. I'm just somebody who's protecting myself the best I can. So I don't personally get into what you're saying, which makes complete sense, and I think is another part of men's experience and probably could be another way to have that conversation with them. But I spend a lot of time in that opening sort of conversation building a really tight container and one that I think people, they know I'm very genuine and I come from a place of compassion, that when I point out that this is about safety and we begin to talk about it and they begin to reflect on how it not only did keep them safe but still can keep them safe, it seems to resonate very, very strongly with them. And they kind of automatically now, because I've created a different container, they're able to talk about that idea of safety or not feeling safe fairly quickly.
So, I think the irony that I see is men, at some level, and maybe this is actually part of the man rules. I don't know. You tell me. But men want to be powerful and men want to be influential. A lot of times, not everybody clearly, but I think a lot do. And I feel like conforming to the man rules actually, in a lot of ways, limits their ability to be, a benevolent definition of powerful or influential. And I wonder if you could talk about what it is like maybe I'll put some context here and say, I really believe that as people become more integrated, and they stop compartmentalizing their lives, I show this version of myself to my family, this version of myself to my buddies, and this version of myself at work or whatever, they become, things dramatically change for them. And I'm wondering if you could maybe talk about what that sort of journey looks like into becoming a less compartmentalized, more integrated person once they start to step outside of the box of the man rules.
I think in some ways you just did. because that's exactly what it is, right? I mean, I go back over and over and over for men to this idea of like, it's not doing it perfectly, it's doing it consciously. And what that means is, giving ourselves a break and allowing ourselves to make mistakes. When it comes to power, the man roles are about power. Being a man in society, for the most part, is about power. Having power, being powerful. What we haven't done for men is provided enough definition for what a healthy sense of power really looks like. And so again, I have that conversation with men. What is power? What does power look like? What is everything you associate with power? And you can put that on a piece of paper and you just kind of, like when I'm in a group, what is everything you associate with power? You put that on a piece of paper. And anything that they want to say, you just put it up there. And they're like looking at all these different things. And then I say, okay, now looking at this list, what are the feelings that come up for you around it? And then it creates like this whole sort of sense of like, well, how does power fit into my life? And like you said, where is it authentic power? Where is it healthy power? Where is it power that limits me? Where is it power that it doesn't give me what I want, but I keep doing it and I keep going to it? And I just am a very, very big believer and advocate for personal inquiry. And I talk about conscious masculinity. Like for me, it's conscious masculinity. When people are like, well, how do you define masculinity? I say it's really simple. I don't. I let each man have his own journey with that concept. And I might point in certain directions or I might offer certain awarenesses, but each man kind of has his own journey with that. And so we absolutely, we talk about power, we talk about sex, we talk about some of these cornerstones of the man rules, and then I invite men to explore it and try on what fits for them and what doesn't fit for them, and be willing to make mistakes, and then check in about that, and then notice, what's working, and I go to one question over and over again, and I learned this through the men's work that I've done, and I found it to be very, very helpful, and just how does that behavior fit with the man you want to be? You just interacted with your spouse a certain way. How does that fit with the man you want to be? Okay, it doesn't. Well, then let's talk about what happened. What man rules were in charge in that space? Okay, now how would you do it differently? Because the danger that some people hear, what they make up about what they think I'm saying or what I'm hearing or what they're hearing from me, is that there's something wrong with the man rules. And I'm not saying that at all. I'm only advocating awareness. Because almost every single man rule there is has value. And so it's more like, when does it fit? And to what degree does it fit? So what does vulnerability with my circle of men look like versus what does it look like with my partner? What does it look like with my daughter? What does it look like with, in a group of people I don't know? And then how did I behave? How does that fit with the man that I want to be? I say I want to be an authentic, connected man. Okay, well, is how I acted there. Does that fit with that? And so that's part of how I do it, is to just to really encourage men to have that constant self-inquiry around who they want to be.
That's, I think that's probably the last question I want to ask you and that's, I don't know how, I'm supposed this manifests itself different in everybody's life, but how I always felt was I thought I was being the man I wanted to be. I was being the man I thought I was supposed to be, but I felt like I wanted at the time because I wasn't doing any personal inquiry, I guess. But, so I thought I was being the man I wanted to be, but I always felt like I was I don't know, probably the best analogy is like swimming upstream somehow. Like for example, I thought I was supposed to like conflict. I fucking hated conflict, and
Yeah.
I would seek it out in the sense that, like, not running around being confrontational, just, willy nilly or whatever. But I mean, if there was a moment where there was a difference of opinion, I would escalate the conflict because I felt like I was supposed to win. And then I would walk away from that conflict feeling like she's like having this fucking knot in my stomach and feeling like shit about it, and analyzing the hell out of the whole conversation, then judging myself for feeling like shit about it, and wondering how, never asking myself the question, maybe I'm going about, like, maybe there's another way. It was more like, the question was, what do I have to do to be able to win next time? Right? Like, where did I go wrong from that point of view? And then, so I guess if there's a guy who is feeling that way, and I'm sure many guys listening to the podcast right now are kind of feeling that, drag that comes with not living in alignment with the person you truly want to be. What's a message you would give them? Like, what's a first step they can take?
Well, you said something really, really important. And you said, I don't know if I was asking myself if that's the man I wanted to be as much as it was the man I'm supposed to be. And that, to me, that's what the man rules do. They put on paper the man that we're supposed to be. And then we get to say, oh, okay, so then how do I want that to fit into my life? So for the men that are kind of feeling this drag, for me, it's just like an opening conversation. Like, I feel like the best gift I can give to a man is to listen, to invite him to layer down a little bit more into what he's saying and kind of what's happening in his life, and then to just offer compassion. And sometimes the compassion comes from me sharing my own story. Sometimes it's just bearing witness to what a man has been carrying by himself, alone, and feeling so disconnected and having this whole internal experience that he's never really been able to give voice to because the man rules don't allow it. Quite honestly, it's the external presentation and the external appearance that matters the most. And I think that's shifting. I think that's shifting in our world dramatically, exponentially. And I think that has pros and cons. And that's maybe a conversation for another time. But I think for these guys, part of the opening is when they notice that something's not working. And then it's just like, how do I connect with a man? And it's more based on instinct and context. So how I would connect with you might be very different than how I would connect with another man. And so I think it really starts with just listening and inviting a man with a certain question to just go a little deeper into that response and into his own reflection. And like I said, I found few things more effective in doing that than engaging with a man in a conversation around the man rules and beginning to see that. But that's one approach. Everybody has their different piece. I think what you're doing is so powerful because you're providing a context for men that is still within the safety of a kind of masculine image and a masculine identity, and then you're kind of, it's not like a bait and switch by any means, but you're giving them the benefit and the gift of a more conscious and emotional life without having it to be embedded in a language that turns a lot of men off or prevents men from hearing a really, really important and powerful message. And I think I do something similarly, but in a different way.
My policy on the Mental Health Warriors show is to, whenever there is a compliment directed my way, regardless of when it happens during the show, I end it. Okay, because I want to go out on a high note, pull a George Costanza and go out on a high note. So no, there was so much amazing insight and actionable advice in there, brother. I mean, and I right back at you, man. The work you're doing is so important, and I can see that it's changing. I mean, it's slow, obviously, but it's people are, I don't know, I have more people in my life now, and I coach more people and more people in the Mental Health Warriors group. And I'm sure it's exactly the same with you, that, once guys realize that they don't actually need to wear the mask, it's really amazing how fast they discard it. So, I just want to thank you for the work you're doing. Thank you for sharing your journey with us, and thank you for being a guest on the podcast, man. So for people that want to get in touch with you and find out more about what you're doing, what is the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, so one of the ways, I would love people to also, if they're really, digging on what you're doing, also to check out my podcast, The Man Rules. In particular, this past month, we've done a really deep dive into addiction and unpacking addiction for men. But in October, we're going to be talking about sex and intimacy. And then November, I'm going to have a really, really open and honest conversation about trauma. And what does that mean for men? And so if some of that has resonated, I hope they check that out. So it's the Man Rules podcast on iTunes and Stitcher and Google Play. And then it's my website, dangriffin.com, and that's Griffin. And we're in the process of of developing some other resources. But that's a great way to get a hold of me through that website and engage more if they're interested in that.
That's wonderful.
And then I have a Facebook page as well, Dan Griffin, MA. So facebook.com/Dan Griffin, MA.
Fantastic. Well, we'll link to all that in the show notes page. Thank you so much for being a guest on the Mental Health Warriors podcast, my friend.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. I appreciated our conversation on my podcast. I love the opportunity to be on yours. And, to all your listeners, they just, thank you for listening, but also, I hope they realize the gift that they get in being able to have you guide them on part of their journey.
Yeah, well, I definitely try to remind them on a regular basis. So if they're not getting it, they will eventually. Take care, man.
All right.
And there you have it. So listen, if you feel like your idea of being a man is driving a pickup truck, drinking beer, beating your wife, and just getting fucking rowdy all the time, and when you see somebody else who's upset, you beat the fuck out of them, that is probably not your greatest, your most efficient path to a meaningful life. Okay, so there's another version of manhood out there, and it's one where you can actually be influential, powerful, connected, and compassionate and kind and empathetic. Those two things actually can go hand in hand. And I think the conversation I just had with Dan shows that not only is it possible that there's people that are actually in the world working to make sure that it does become possible. So thanks, Dan. Keep up the great work, brother. And thanks for coming on the show. And I love being on your show as well. And I'm going to end this episode like I end every episode by saying, listen, motherfucker, if you are struggling, I want you to know that I have struggled too. And if you ever want to talk to me, I will not judge you. So how about that? How's that for an offer? All right. And so, like I say all the time too, that gift of safety is a gift that you have the power to give somebody else. And it's a gift that you can give today. So do it. And I'm just realizing my voice sounds kind of nasal because it's kind of early in the morning. I don't know what to do with that. But we will see you at the next episode of the Mental Health Show. And stay tuned for some interesting, exciting announcements about this show coming up really, really soon.